Okay, everybody, it's Kevin Lockett once again. I'm tired. I need some water. We have a distinguished guest today, a professor. I think you are the first professor. I've had a lot of talented people who spoke on college campuses, but a real professor, tenured professor, Mr. Johnny Smith, author of this wonderful book. Look at it. Jumpman, The Making and Meaning of Michael Jordan, or Michael Jeffrey Jordan to his friend. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing great, Kevin. How are you?
I am fine here in Akron, Ohio. It is December, but it's 50 degrees, so I am not unhappy. And where you at? You are in Georgia, correct?
Yeah, I'm in a suburb of Atlanta, and we're gearing up for final exams. My class has a final exam tomorrow, so I'm answering emails from students who are worried about getting prepared. And but it's been a fun semester. It's a class on the history of sports. I teach it every year. And that's a class that shapes the subjects that I write about, the questions that I ask in my research and in my writing. And my students ask great questions. And so, when I published Jumpman, they asked me all sorts of questions. Well, how long does it take to write a book? And where do you get your research materials? And how do you develop your ideas and organize the book? Really great questions. And so it's great to have an opportunity to talk to students about the fact that they can be not just consumers of knowledge, but creators of knowledge. If they have an interest in a subject, they can investigate it. And so I think that's one of the things I love about being a historian, about being a professor, is teaching students not just what I do, but teach them how to learn about history and the skills they can cultivate studying history. And at any rate, we can talk about that if it interests you, but that's what's on my mind this morning or this afternoon.
I do have one question. So what does it take to be a really effective professor?
Well, I think it depends on the kind of institution where you teach. I'm at Georgia Tech. It's considered a research institution. So what that means is that there's an expectation that the faculty not only teach courses, undergraduate courses, graduate courses, but also you have a research agenda, a research profile. And in history, that entails projects that I will publish either in academic journals or in books or making public presentations or going to academic conferences. So that's a little bit of what I do outside of the classroom. Inside the classroom, I teach courses on American history, popular culture, sports history. And so that's always been my focus in terms of teaching. And I have undergraduate students that I teach and mentor. I have graduate students who I advise. And so I have a number of different hats at Georgia Tech. And I won't bore you, of course, with committee work, but it's important work in terms of service. But that's also part of the job, too.
Right. So speaking of research, so the book here about Michael Jordan, I love this book. And the reason I love this book, the epilogue basically sums up how I feel about this book. So the epilogue title is The Last Dance. And if anybody out there has watched The Last Dance, and if you had questions about some of the people in the Jordan universe, I think this book is an amazing book because if you had questions about the bad boys, there's a bad boy section. There's questions about Phil Jackson, there's a Phil Jackson section. If you have questions about Jerry Krause, there are sections upon sections. I don't know how long it took you to put together this book. You could almost spin this off like a Wu-Tang album. You can say, hey, here's my Magic Johnson book. Here's my Bad Boys book. You set yourself up to make multiple books after this one. So I admire this book a lot.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I decided to write this book before I knew about The Last Dance. I'm a Chicago kid. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago in the 80s and 90s. So Jordan was my childhood hero. I was part of that Jordan generation that wanted to be like Mike. So fast forward, once I became a historian and an author, I had always written about prominent sports figures, particularly Black sports figures. I've always been interested in the role of race as it intersects in the world of sports and how prominent Black athletes have shaped the Black freedom struggle, how some have engaged activism and others like Jordan have avoided it. And so I don't know, maybe sometime around 2019, I started thinking about it a little bit. I was finishing my previous book. Then my daughter was born. Then we go into the pandemic in 2020. And I was still thinking about this project. Of course, not knowing when I might be able to travel again. But I had collected a bunch of primary source material. And so I thought, I think now is the time. I said to myself, no one's talking about Michael Jordan anymore. I think there's an opportunity. Then, of course, The Last Dance comes out. And it was like, whenever I would sit down to write, that was the gorilla in the room, like just kind of over my shoulder, because I knew that The Last Dance completely changed the conversation around Jordan. He went from being this owner of the Charlotte Hornets that was, up in the skybox or on the front court seats that, local reporters in North Carolina may have covered him, interviewed him, but he was in the background really in terms of NBA culture. The Last Dance, suddenly now Jordan is the center of our sports universe. There's no live sporting events taking place at that time in the pandemic. People on social media are talking about The Last Dance. It triggers this kind of nostalgia for the Jordan era. Everyone who has a podcast or a sports talk radio show, they're talking about MJ. They're dissecting the episodes. They're interviewing his former teammates. So all that is a way to say that it felt as if it made me feel as if I wasn't sure what lane I was going to find with all of this dialogue taking place around Jordan. But I stuck to my core mission, and that was this. I had always felt that in the biographies that were written about Jordan, mostly by journalists, and the coverage of him when he was playing with the Bulls, that the story of race was really overlooked or marginalized. At different flashpoints, there was discussion about his line, Republicans buy shoes too. But I had always felt that in order to understand Jordan's importance in American culture, we had to think about how race shaped his journey and how he created himself, but also how Americans interpreted Jordan through the lens of race. And I think that was something that was important in trying to understand how I saw him as a white kid growing up in a predominantly white community in the suburbs of Chicago, but also what he meant to the Black community as well. And so those are the questions that I was really thinking about that weren't really addressed in The Last Dance. Jordan discusses them very briefly, but that's not the purpose of the film. The purpose of the film is really to enhance the legend of the GOAT, right? And that's done really well. And so if you think about The Last Dance as a product of what we might call hagiography, it's not really a true documentary in that sense. It's to romanticize and polish the image of Jordan as this legendary competitor. And it succeeds on all fronts, right? It's a fantastic film in that regard. It's thoroughly entertaining. And we get these great moments from Jordan where, the director shows him a clip of what, Isaiah Thomas has to say. And you see Jordan raise his eyebrows and respond, or maybe what a teammate had to say about playing with him and how ruthless he could be as a competitor and how hard it could be on his teammates. So those parts I think are really fascinating about the film. But, with Jordan, we don't really get to the interior of the man. And so in the preface of Jumpman, I write about how he had crafted this mystique, this mystery about the most famous athlete in the world, that he only let people get in so close into his inner world. And I write about how that was partly a product of his upbringing, how he inherited these traits from his father, James Jordan, but also that mystique was shaped by the culture, the political culture, race in America, and how Jordan had to present himself in a certain way in order to avoid alienating the public, because he wanted to maintain his prestige as the most successful endorser in America.
It's interesting because I believe you wrote a book on Ali and Malcolm X, I believe.
That's right.
And I always had this theory about Jordan and those guys in that era, and I don't think it comes up too often. Ali lost a lot when he spoke up. And part of me feels like these guys who grew up watching Ali, even though they admired him, when it came time for these guys to make money, they realized what happened to him as a Black man. If you speak up, this is what happens to you. Yeah, bless you.
Yeah.
So sometimes when I look at Jordan, I often wonder, it's like, is that part of it too? Did he grow up watching what happened to Ali? And maybe he went through this lane of, I'm not going to offend anybody just because I'm partly a capitalist, but at the same time, I saw how damaged Ali was even up to his death. Even though when people came around later, he didn't really get the endorsements he deserved. They took him out of his prime as a boxer. So I often wonder, not just Jordan, most of those guys in that generation really didn't speak up much about anything, maybe except for Craig Hodges and a few other people. It wasn't until LeBron and the Heat in 2012 that things started to change. And that's a big, long gap. So it wasn't just Jordan.
Totally, Kevin. I think context is crucial here, as you point out, that think about what happens in the late 70s. That's when free agency comes to professional sports. So the economics of the sporting world is changing in that period in the post Ali era, really, right? If you think about the height of Ali, maybe 1975 with the Thrilla in Manila. But then after that, his career is going to be on the downward end. So you have free agency changing the economics of professional sports in the second half of the 70s. And at the same time, in the late 70s and early 80s, the NBA is in trouble. Economically, the league appears to investors, advertisers, and the owners to not be appealing to a predominantly white audience. And there are stories circulating in the press that this is a league that's 75% black, and that these players are quote unquote lazy, unmotivated, self-absorbed, too focused now on their contracts in this period of free agency. And the worst part is that the majority of them supposedly are using drugs, cocaine in particular. And so it created this image crisis for the league. 2/3 of the NBA franchises were in the red. It's in trouble. And so by the time of, say, 1983, 1984, when David Stern makes the transition as becoming NBA commissioner, he recognizes he has to rehabilitate the image of the league to make it attractive to Madison Avenue advertisers and the television networks. That's his number one goal, because ultimately what happens is it's television where the NBA owners make their money. By 1990, David Stern would say that 80% of our revenue comes from TV. And that's in the age of cable, and that's growing the audience for the sport, on and on. So how does this all pertain to Jordan? In order for Jordan to achieve this universal acceptance, he has to position himself as the antithesis of the militant, politically outspoken black athlete, as the antithesis of the sort of drug-using NBA player who is really faceless in many ways to the larger white sports public. But he's acutely aware of the fact that when he comes to the Bulls in 1984, there is no demand from corporations to make black basketball players their spokesman. But what David Falk is able to do, his agent, is to get him some deals that make sense for the companies. And the first two he does, Nike and Wilson. And Falk's point is, look, these deals make a lot of sense because Jordan is seen as an authentic spokesman. He's not having to be something he's not. He's a basketball player. It makes sense for him to sell basketball shoes with Nike and basketballs with Wilson. The Nike deal in particular was crucial because Nike invested a significant amount of money in Jordan in a way that no other footwear company had ever done. That gave Falk some leverage. Jordan's appearing on TV in 1985. And so these other companies now that have nothing to do with sports, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Chevrolet, Falk's position is, look, you have less risk now. The public recognizes Jordan now because he's on television more from these Nike commercials, and he's selling these shoes. When Jordan signed the Nike deal, this is just remarkable. When he signed the original Nike deal, it was a 5-year deal. And basically, he has 3 years to sell a significant figure of shoes. I think it was something like $3 million. And by the end of the first year, they sell well over $100 million of Nike shoes. So now what Jordan has done with Nike is demonstrate he can move product. So that's going to catch the eye of the executives at McDonald's and Coca-Cola and Chevrolet. And so they invest in him. And so this is kind of the snowball effect that's happening. But I try to remind readers in Jumpman, this was highly unusual. Yes, Julius Erving had a number of endorsement deals, as did Magic Johnson, but they were really the exception. And the fact is that both Irving and Magic and Isaiah Thomas and Larry Bird, they were all with Converse. And Converse did not put out a single line investing dollars to distinguish a Julius Erving shoe, for example, in the way that Nike did with the Air Jordan sneaker. So there is a transformation taking place. And all of this is taking place in an age where major black celebrities in the mid to late 1980s recognize that they cannot alienate the white buying public. And Jordan is acutely aware of that. He gave this interview in 1989 to a GQ reporter where he says that basically he's afraid. His biggest fear in life is that he'll make some grave mistake where white parents will tell their white kids, you can't admire this man. He's made a mistake. And that would, quote, change me from Michael Jordan, the basketball player, to Michael Jordan, the black guy. And so that, I think, is part of the story that is completely missing from The Last Dance. It's completely missing from these narratives where Jordan's racial consciousness undoubtedly shaped the way he presented himself to the public, the way he engaged the political arena, and why the white public, we should say, saw him as a hero who was non-threatening. He didn't seem to harbor any racial resentment. He wasn't like those quote unquote coked out black players that preceded him. And so that's all part of the narratives that are swirling around Jordan when he comes to the league and through the 80s.
You have a section called the Spike and Mike Show. And I'm a big fan of Spike Lee. I was a fan of Spike Lee since She's Gotta Have It. So when the commercials first popped up with Mars Blackman and Michael Jordan, for me, it's like, this is fantastic. Bless you once again. But it was fantastic for me. It's like, oh my God, it's Spike and Mars Blackman. I don't know if that can happen today. If you take someone like Wemby, let's say there was a young filmmaker like Spike Lee and a guy like Wemby, with algorithms and target marketing, I don't know if you can still do a Mars Blackman, Michael Jordan commercial today. I mean, today as you did back.
Yeah. It's interesting. When we think about the creation of that commercial, it's really a byproduct of Spike Lee's imagination. Like, he's the key ingredient. He's the creative genius in the making of the Mars and Mike show, really. And of course, the Whedon and Kenny advertising team that sees the appearance of the Mars Blackman character in the movie She's Gotta Have It, that he has this obsession with his Air Jordans where, he doesn't even take them off when he's making love to his girlfriend. And of course, the first commercials come out in 88, but then in 89, in another Spike Lee film, Do the Right Thing, the shoes appear on the feet of Buggin' Out. This incredible scene too. So Spike plays a real important role in turning this shoe into a totem, an emblem of popular culture, right? A status symbol. Because if you think about it, before those Spike and Mike commercials appeared for Nike, the Nike commercials were really just like highlights of Jordan dunking. It wasn't really special. But Spike Lee creates a storyline and turns Jordan into a character, really, on television. And if you watch these commercials sequentially, it was as if there was this ongoing show, and people were excited when a new Mars and Mike commercial appeared. And so that show, I think, really helped create this idea that Jordan's life was part of a larger series of clips, really, and that he's becoming an entertainer as much as a basketball player. And those shoes, really, I think, the fat infatuation with the shoes reflected a culture where people define themselves through these sneakers, right? You are what you wear. You gain status by buying and wearing these shoes that are hard to get, that they're expensive. And, that was true of white consumers and black consumers. But I think what's often forgotten about that is that, black male hip hop artists, they made those shoes popular first in the black community. And then you had young white people who listened to hip hop music and they saw the pictures of these artists wearing the Air Jordan shoes. And so these black artists and Spike together made the shoes cool, right? They're conveyors of cool. And everybody wants to be cool. Everybody wants to be like Mike. And so that just drove the sales for these Air Jordans. And they took off in the late 80s and into the 90s, certainly.
Yeah, I'm going to jump around a bit. You discussed Michael Jordan's gambling in the book, but you also discussed the source of how this began. And little Michael Jordan, when he was in North Carolina, he kept on getting into these accidents. He almost died. And you kind of framed this in the book, like he developed this thing, almost like a Tupac thing, where Tupac made so much material, like he thought he was going to die. It seemed like Michael Jordan, the way he was so intense and the way it's almost like carpe diem, moment by moment. Like, it's almost like he had not like a death wish. He just felt like, well, I'm not going to be long anyway, so I'm just going to do what I want to do. But yeah, speak about how the young Michael Jordan influenced the older Michael Jordan, good or bad, when it came to his gambling.
Yeah, so as I was wrapping up the last chapter of the book, I was writing about these reports about Jordan getting involved with gamblers on the golf course and the enormous debts that he owed, guys like Slim Boulder. And, if you think back to that period, people wanted to know sort of, well, why does he have this impulse to gamble? And Jordan really was offended by these questions. He did not want to have to defend himself or explain himself to the public. His view was, this is my private time. It's my money. He had not committed a crime. And so I think for him, he increasingly in that period in 91, 92, is becoming more hardened to the press, where he's developing this shell where he does not want to answer questions that don't have anything to do with basketball in his mind. But if we go back to his youth, what I tried to explain is, well, where does this impulse come to seek these thrills, to find instant gratification? Because it's not just about the competition, I think, for Michael. Yes, he's been described as the most competitive man on earth. This is more about competition. And I think for Jordan, it's that, he's looking for those thrills constantly, every day. And so when he wasn't playing basketball, what makes golf more interesting? Let's raise the stakes, And if you go back to his youth, I wrote about how he had several accidents. One time he was chopping wood with an axe and he chopped off part of his toe. And another time he got trapped in this hog pen and electrocuted, basically. I mean, it was terrible things. He's a product of the country, though. And so I think he learned at an early age that, the risks come with the rewards. When you pursue these thrills, as a kid is, racing with his brothers out in the country and in the woods or whatever, living this daring life, tomorrow's not promised to you. And so he lived for the moment. And that meant proving himself in every opportunity he had, whether it was on the golf course, a game of cards, on the basketball court. I think that really shaped the way he thought about life. And so that's sort of, how I was approaching that question.
You have a chapter called Raging Bull. And in that book, in that section, Michael could be very intense, very hard on his teammates. And I started thinking about Kobe Bryant, because Kobe Bryant technically was like him in a lot of ways. But towards the end of Kobe's career, I think after he tore his Achilles and came back, Kobe changed. Like, he was actually more in tune with his teammates. He actually was more giving. He actually changed from almost like that Jordan-esque type thing that he had. Michael was totally different. he stayed being that guy from beginning to end. Do you think that he felt like, in your research, do you think he felt like he was misunderstood by his teammates, or he only did this because he wanted to win and he wasn't going to let anybody keep him from winning?
I think it's more the latter. I don't think he was someone who was particularly concerned about whether or not his teammates related to him. But that was a problem for Phil Jackson, because, before they win their first title, Phil's point is, you have this special gift. No one can touch that gift, but you alone cannot win. And, I think also for Tex Winter, one of Jackson's assistants, he thought, the problem with Michael is that he thinks he can do it alone. And I think that wore on his teammates, who felt like, your way is not winning a championship. You're going to have to, at some point, trust us to succeed with you, right? Not outside of you. And that was a hard thing for Jordan. I think one of the things I try to emphasize, maybe it's more implicit than explicit in the book, is that if you think about Jordan's personality, he always wants to be in control. That's why he doesn't want to give up the ball. He wants to maintain control. It's also why he doesn't want to have these conversations about civil rights and politics, because he knows once he starts to open himself up to that kind of discussion and participate, whether it's with a social action group or a political party or a candidate or whatever, he's giving up control of the conversation. Someone else is dictating the terms. He doesn't want to do that in life. He always wants to dictate the terms. And so I emphasize in the preface of the book just how important independence was to Jordan. He wants to remain independent. He doesn't want to be held back by anyone or anything. And I think that's a theme throughout the book that I try to highlight in terms of the way he approached the game of basketball, his teammates, and the decisions he made off the court.
I don't think I was doing laundry today, and I was thinking over the book, and I started thinking about LeBron and him or Magic Johnson, and I felt like most people can't be those guys. And I'm not talking about the physical prowess and all that stuff. The day in and day out being Michael Jordan, the day in and day out being LeBron James, the mental capacity, the mental health part of it, of your life is no longer your own. As soon as you step out the door, you're on. When you're inside, that's fine. But once you step out the door, you're this dude. You can't make a mistake. If you do make a mistake, you got to fix it. You can't misspeak. You can't, when you go out to eat, people are coming at you at all times.
Right.
I don't think most people are built to live that type of life. So in a lot of ways, the guys and women in these circumstances as well, who can maintain that without losing their mind is amazing to me, because I know maybe I couldn't do it. Maybe for a little while, and I think I would go back into a cave and disappear.
Yeah. Jordan gave an interview with Playboy magazine in 1992, and he talked about this very idea that, sometimes people would say to him, I'd love to be Michael Jordan for a day. And he raised his eyebrows like, really? Okay. And he outlined what you're describing here. Like, you start your day and you've got public appearances or shooting commercial for hours at end in the middle of the night. Flying coast to coast to appear here and to appear there. There's always a demand. There's always some publicist or reporter tugging at you. They need your time. They need your attention. They need your energy. And of course, he has a wife. He has kids. He has to practice. He has to train. It's almost too much. It's hard to imagine, as you say, living that life. Like, to have the ability to withstand the physical and emotional drain of living that life. And I can't imagine it. But I think, for Jordan, one of the things that he did increasingly in his career at the Bulls, part of it I don't think was by choice necessarily, but more of like survival, is when they're on the road, he's holed up in the hotel room, right? And so he would have, either his dad come stay with him in the hotel room, or his buddies come stay with him, because he couldn't leave. He couldn't even go down to the restaurant in the hotel to have dinner with his teammates. They always had to come to him. And I remember Charles Barkley talking about this, that like by 1992, you always had to go to Michael. He could not meet you anywhere. The only time Charles would see Michael was out on a golf course, right? And they could make arrangements to play at some private club where there was, no access to the press or the public. So, but I think that wore on him. In this regard, I think too that Jordan's very different from Magic. In writing about the 1991 finals, David Halberstam compared the two smiles between Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson. And it struck me that, Magic Johnson never found a camera that he couldn't flash that smile. Always. Jordan was different. His smile was one that appeared more in times where he felt like he had to give it to you. Like he's after a game asking about it, he kind of smiles through it. But Magic, he could light up a room, and he loved to be on stage. Michael Jordan didn't love to be on stage in the same way. He didn't. And I think that was very difficult for him, because his whole life, to your point, was being crafted for public consumption. And so I think that wore on him, that he could never get off the stage. And I think that was harder for him than for Magic.
Let's talk about something fun. So we just had the NBA in season tournament. I was very skeptical of it, especially those courts. But at the end, people seem to enjoy it, right? There's a story in the book that I never heard of before, that back in the 90s, HBO approached Magic and Michael about doing a one-on-one, almost pay-per-view type situation. And they were in on it. They wanted to do it. And David Stern and even Isaiah Thomas, but we can talk about him later, didn't want to do it because Stern felt like Will's gambling on all that stuff. But what did you, because I never heard this story before about Magic and Michael doing a one-on-one. But it's fascinating now that the NBA is fully embraced with Vegas. All these teams now are in Vegas. Although Oakland Athletics are now going to Vegas. Like, everybody's now in Vegas, but now back in the day, 30 years ago, it's like Vegas was like a no-no to the league.
Yeah, I think the fundamental difference between this proposal from the HBO execs was that it would be sponsored by Caesar's Palace and HBO, not the NBA, right? So the problem for Magic and Michael is that it was an exhibition like that was not organized by the NBA, violated the collective bargaining agreement. And as the head of the NBA PA, that's what Isaiah Thomas said. He says, like, it's not sanctioned by the NBA. We can't allow players to just go and play in tournaments and games whenever they want. There's too much risk. It could potentially damage the NBA. So you could understand why both ownership and the Players Association in general might not approve. But it would have been an incredible event, right? Like, if you would think about this game in 1990, it would have been before Jordan and Johnson played in the NBA Finals. This incredible moment where Jordan's really trying to reach the NBA mountaintop, if you will, where Magic was the king of the court. But it doesn't happen for the reasons that I stated a moment ago. Jordan, I think, though, was a little bit torn. Like, on the one hand, I think he liked the idea. His competitive side was like, yeah, I'd like to go out there and, whip Magic's ass. I'd love to do that. And he probably would have, right? Like, Michael obviously was the better one-on-one player. And Magic, I think, who by that time already has his 5 rings, is thinking, I keep hearing how Michael's the best player in the game. I'm going to show that I can play one-on-one too. I can take him. I can use my size. I can, back him down. I can surprise some people, and I'm in on this. But it tells you something larger, I think, about the NBA culture that is relevant to today. And that is this, that in the age of Michael and Magic, the cult of personality dominates everything. It dominates the way that these promoters at HBO and Caesar's Palace thought about holding such an event. It shaped the way that NBC and TNT marketed their games. It was always Magic and the Lakers against Michael and the Bulls. The player came first, right? It was always about the individual star, and that's true today as well. The NBA still markets the league through its stars, and historically, that's part of what has differentiated the sport from, say, Major League Baseball and the NFL. Not to say that Major League Baseball and the NFL don't promote their stars too, but the historical framing has been very different. And so I think if we think about basketball, it's a much more intimate sport than either baseball or football. Football players, they got helmets on. You can't really see them. You recognize them by their jersey number. The quarterback's on the field. He's the star of the game for, I don't know, maybe half the time, depending on that. In baseball, the biggest slugger comes to play maybe 4 times a game. But in basketball, the biggest stars, they're basically on the screen constantly. And so really, I think basketball was a sport that was made for television in that regard, and really just perfectly made for selling stars.
How do you feel about Jordan Pippen's relationship? There's a Scottie Pippen's story in the book is really fascinating. All the stories are fascinating, but it's interesting when you kind of learn more about Scottie Pippen. What was their relationship like? Because I always thought they were kind of cool, not like best friends, but I always thought they were cool with each other. But in recent years, it just seems like I don't know who dislikes Michael more, Isaiah Thomas or Scottie Pippen. I can't decipher who hates Mike more. I don't even know where all this stuff came from. I don't know why Isaiah's still mad at Mike. I don't know why Pippen. Like, it's fascinating.
Yeah,
it's progressed over the past 30 years.
I think it comes down to ego, Kevin. Like, all these guys, they play in their egos. They live in their egos. And it comes down to masculinity too, right? Which is attached to ego, that they want to be the dominant male figure in the room, on the court, and getting credit for that success matters to each of them. One of the things that stands out about The Last Dance is that when you listen to Michael talk, or a lot of his teammates talk, there's not a lot of joy, right? Like, they're not celebratory. They don't pine for the celebrations in the locker room. You don't really get that sense from them. And then after The Last Dance was released, Scotty and some of Jordan's teammates, they're furious because they feel like, in this regard, Michael had a say in the production. Now, Michael will tell you, I was hands off, even though he got to review the final cut, that he didn't influence the film. But come on, this is a film that's built entirely around Jordan. And I think Scotty felt marginalized and felt like this was a pattern, that it was always about Michael, and that Michael could have gone out of his way to tell the director that there should be more about my teammates, right? Like, this should also be a story, if it's about The Last Dance, about the contributions of my teammates. And it's not to say that the teammates weren't ignored, but they were not the center of the story. And so, what does Scotty do? He writes his story. He publishes his own memoir very quickly after The Last Dance. And if you read the opening of that autobiography, he goes right after Michael and talks about basically how Michael hurt him by disregarding him, by dismissing him, by treating him basically as, his sidekick. And so you wonder where all that hurt comes from, as you say. Like, there's real pain there. I think for Scotty, he felt like they should have been better friends. But because Michael didn't want that they were not better friends. Now, when in that late 80s, 1990 period, before they won their first title, I think Michael had his real doubts about Scotty. Could Scotty develop into a real consistent all-star caliber player, show up every night the way Michael needed his, right-hand man to do so every night? And I don't think he really knew if Scotty would do it. But Scotty has a phenomenal season in 1991, a great playoff run in 1991. He's a key figure in beating the Lakers in the 91 finals. And so Scotty gets over, so to speak, and he proves himself to Michael. Michael recognizes his talents, his abilities. And so part of that too, though, Scotty became a better defender, and he's one of the best defenders of all time, by guarding Jordan in practice every day. He had to think about, how do you stop this guy who's unstoppable? And I think that made Scotty a better thinker on the court. It made him a more versatile player. And so they needed each other. It was a symbiotic relationship. But the problem for Scotty, in terms of thinking about his legacy, is that whenever anyone talks about Scottie Pippen, they always do it in the context of Michael Jordan, as we are doing right now, right? But whenever people bring up Michael Jordan, they don't necessarily bring up Scottie Pippen. And I think that is what defines the relationship and will always define the relationship. And it's grading for Scotty. I think the other thing too for Scotty is, during the pandemic, he lost one of his sons. And I don't know all the details, but I think he was grieving. And he was grieving at the same time, though, that he was doing a lot of these interviews with the press, promoting the book, promoting his new alcohol line. I don't know exactly what it is, but, he had a new liquor line. And he goes on the Dan Patrick Show and he accused Phil Jackson of being a racist. He didn't necessarily give any examples outside of claiming that, in 94, Phil dribbled play for Tony Kukoc to win a game. And I don't think that exactly proves Scotty's point. And so then the public was sort of looking at Scotty like, what's going on with you? And Scotty has always struggled to explain himself. It's sort of interesting to think about how this young man from small town in Arkansas, who at one point had a stutter, was very shy, wasn't comfortable giving interviews to the Chicago press, would eventually become a commentator for ESPN, sitting there with the crew over there talking about the games. But then I think when it comes time to, he can analyze the game, no doubt. He's been successful in that regard. But then I think when people wanted to understand his feelings about Michael or Phil, I think he struggled to articulate those things. But I think there's a lot of personal pain there, and I don't think we're going to all really grasp all of it. I certainly don't. I can only gather bits and pieces from what Scotty has shared. But I think it's ultimately, I guess what I would say is it's kind of sad, because you can really see the pain on Scotty's face. And I think that's a genuine pain.
Right. I guess I'll make this the final question, because there's so much to talk about. In your research on Michael Jordan, and when you finished the book, what was the one thing or a couple of things that really surprised you about Jordan that you didn't know before?
I had heard this story about Jordan and Jerry Krause in this riff from 1986. And it's played in the documentary. It's when Jordan breaks his foot, and Jerry Reinsdorf, the owner of the Bulls, and Jerry Krause, the GM of the Bulls, they just want Jordan to rehab, follow doctor's orders. Long story short, he's back in Chapel Hill. He's supposed to be taking classes to finish his degree, but he's out there playing, testing the foot, trying to get ready because he wants to come back. Of course, Michael Jordan, now that we all know this competitive fire, he's got to get back. Even if at this point, the Bulls aren't going to be beating the Celtics in a series and going on to win the Eastern Conference. And when Jerry Krause finds out that he's been practicing on this foot, They have a meeting. It's a very heated meeting. And what surprised me is that, Jerry Krause tells Jordan, "You're Bulls property now. We tell you what to do." And Jordan's response is that I'm a human being. My autonomy is crucial, right? Like, I'm going to protect the most valuable thing in my career, and that is my body. And I don't think you can disentangle this story from the history of race in the NBA, where white executives had historically taken a paternalistic position toward predominantly Black players in the league. And so I think that when I was really analyzing this riff through the press as it was published in the Chicago papers, Jordan says, I was independent. I had value to myself. I was not going to let Jerry Krause control me. And so I think that what was really surprising is to think about how, even though Jordan doesn't necessarily explicitly say, like, that's a racist thing to say, like it is, that kind of statement is rooted in treating athletes as if they are property of ownership. But in a way, Jordan was making this claim like, I'm asserting my freedom here. I'm going to play. And eventually he gets Reinsdorf to bend to his will, basically let him come back. That's one thing that surprised me. The other thing that surprised me, and I write extensively about this, is that in the late 80s, when Jordan's doing more and more interviews and he's asked about race, he takes this position that he doesn't want the public to see him as a Black man. And he embraces this idea of colorblindness, that race doesn't matter. But what I try to make clear in the book is that undoubtedly race mattered. Otherwise, Jordan wouldn't be sitting there saying that race doesn't matter, right? And he doesn't want you to see him as a Black man. And I try to show how Jordan had to bury his past battles with racism and avoid any discussion of race in order to achieve universal acceptance. And so one of the main arguments I make in Jumpman is that Black sports heroes have always held a tenuous position of acceptance with white America. And that's the story of Michael Jordan. It's a story that's not really a part of The Last Dance. And so for me, I tried to answer some fundamental questions in the book. Number one, how did race shape the way that Jordan saw himself? And number two, how did race shape the way the public saw Michael Jordan? And that's that tension, that dilemma that Jordan is always dealing with. On the one hand, race matters because he's trying to demonstrate that, hey, a Black basketball player can be the face of all these companies, can be the most successful American endorser in the world. On the other hand, he wants to downplay race. It's really not that significant because everybody makes me successful, as he says. I belong to everybody. He's essentially positioning himself as the universal hero. And that's the role that Jordan wanted to play.
We just scratched the surface of this amazing book, Jumpman. The Making of Me of Michael Jordan. There's so many questions I want to ask, like Phil Jackson, but you got to get the book. Johnny Smith, thank you. Where can they find you, sir?
Thank you so much. Good to meet you.
Good to meet you. And where can they, if they want to find out more information about you and the book, where can they go?
Well, I'm on Twitter at SportsHistProf. And also, I have an email account. If you have any questions, just Google Johnny Smith, Georgia Tech. You'll find my email address. You'll find my faculty page. And I've written other books about the history of sports that may interest readers as well.
All right. Well, back to being a professor, Mr. Smith. I will keep on reading this book. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it.
Appreciate you, sir.
Okay.